He was the supreme commander of an army of millions, the wealthiest man in his dynasty, and the symbolic head of a 600-year-old empire. He presided over the slaughter of millions. He watched his armies get annihilated in Galicia, frozen to death in the Carpathians, and systematically destroyed in a catastrophe he personally foresaw. And he did nothing. He was not a tyrant or a monster, but a good man who, by abdicating his power, enabled the destruction of his own world. He lost his empire, his command, and his fortune, yet he was never punished. He died peacefully in his bed at the age of 80. His name was Archduke Friedrich, Duke of Teschen. How does a man with supreme authority, a man who had everything, become a hollow phantom, a footnote, so irrelevant that history has completely forgotten him? That hollowness was inevitable. Friedrich was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled. The world of ancient aristocratic tradition that made him, and the world of modern total war he was forced to command. Archduke Friedrich Maria Albrecht Wilhelm Karl of Austria-Teschen was born on June 4, 1856, in Groß-Sielowitz, Moravia, part of the sprawling Austrian Empire. He was a member of the Habsburg Tuscany branch, a lineage that traced its roots back to Emperor Leopold II, a figure of the Enlightenment. But by Friedrich's time, the nuances of lineage mattered less than the simple, overwhelming fact of his blood. He was a Habsburg. That name was both a birthright and a prison. It meant that his life was not his own. It belonged to the dynasty, to the emperor, and to the complex, suffocating web of tradition that had governed Central Europe for 600 years. His core tragedy was this: he was groomed his entire life for responsibility, but not for authority. He was taught duty, but not innovation. He was elevated to the highest possible role, supreme military commander. At the precise moment, his particular set of virtues, caution, amiability, and a talent for administration, were utterly useless. The fateful twist that sealed his legacy, and the fate of his empire, was not an action he took, but one he failed to take. When a Bosnian Serb assassin murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, it did more than just kill the heir to the throne. It ripped open a power vacuum. The Emperor Franz Joseph was 84 years old, a grieving, weary titan clinging to the past. The new heir, Archduke Karl, was young and inexperienced. The army needed a supreme commander, a generalissimus. By dynastic seniority and family tradition, the role fell to Friedrich. He accepted it out of duty, but on that same day, he made a decision that would render him a phantom at the head of his own army. He publicly and privately deferred all strategic and operational decisions to his chief of staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf. Friedrich, the cautious landowner, would handle the ceremonies and the paperwork. Conrad, the brilliant, aggressive, and utterly reckless ideologue, would wage the war. Friedrich became a ceremonial figurehead, a royal stamp of approval on a series of catastrophic decisions that he himself foresaw but felt powerless, or perhaps unwilling to stop. His deference, born of a lifetime of Habsburg training, would lead directly to the empire's collapse and the personal loss of his entire unimaginable fortune. To understand how a man so powerful could be so tragically hollow, you must first understand the world that made him a world of glittering decay, ancient rules, and a family that was beginning to suffocate on its own legacy. This was the world of the Old Guard, the late Austro-Hungarian Empire. When Friedrich was born in 1856, the empire was ruled, as it had been since 1848, by Emperor Franz Joseph I. The emperor was not just a monarch, he was an institution, a semi-divine symbol of stability, in a multi-ethnic state that was threatening to tear itself apart. His empire was a patchwork quilt of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Slovens, Ukrainians, Romanians, and Italians, all bound together not by a shared identity, but by shared allegiance to the Habsburg crown. The empire's government was a masterpiece of bureaucratic inertia, a system so complex and resistant to change that it famously administered itself to death. This was a world that prized loyalty over genius, tradition over innovation, and bloodline over merit. The very pinnacle of this old guard, the man who cast the longest shadow over Friedrich's life, was his uncle, Archduke Albert, Duke of Teschen. Albert was everything Friedrich was not. He was a genuine military hero, the celebrated victor of the Battle of Custoza in 1866, where he had decisively defeated the Italians. He was a stern, autocratic, and deeply conservative field marshal who dominated the Austro-Hungarian army for decades, serving as its inspector general. He was the living embodiment of the dynasty's reliance on itself. But more than that, Archduke Albert was spectacularly, titanically wealthy. He had inherited the Teschen line, which brought with it vast industrial properties, including coal mines and factories in Silesia, and immense agricultural estates. He was a feudal lord and a modern industrial magnate rolled into one. He represented the iron-fisted reactionary power of the dynasty. Friedrich's father was Albert's brother, and when Archduke Albert died in 1895, he left no surviving male heirs. His entire fortune, the title, the palaces, the lands, the factories, and the priceless art collection housed in the Albertina Palace in Vienna passed to his eldest nephew, Friedrich. Overnight, Friedrich went from being just another archduke to being the wealthiest man in the Habsburg family, second only to the emperor himself in prestige, and far exceeding him in personal liquid assets. He now owned the estates of Hungarian Altenburg in Hungary, Saybush in Poland, and Selowitz in the Czech Republic. He was, in effect, a sovereign prince within the empire. This inheritance was meant to reinforce the system. It was the ultimate expression of dynastic nepotism. The greatest military fortune in the empire was handed to a man based purely on his bloodline, a man who had, up to that point, been a competent but unremarkable corps commander. He inherited his uncle's power, but not his uncle's iron will. He inherited the role of the dynasty's military guardian, but he lacked the ruthless authority that was needed to truly hold it. This rigid system was suffocating under the weight of myriad threats. Externally, the empire was surrounded. To the east, the Russian Empire loomed, styling itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples, including the millions of Slavs living inside Austria-Hungary. To the south, the small aggressive kingdom of Serbia actively agitated for the liberation of Serbs and Croats from Habsburg rule, becoming a hotbed of nationalism and terrorism. The alliance with Germany provided security but also dragged the empire into Germany's own global ambitions. Internally, the threats were even more dire. The ethnic unrest was not just background noise, it was the daily reality. The Hungarians, having forced the creation of the dual monarchy in 1867, constantly vied for more power, often obstructing the central government in Vienna. The Czechs in Bohemia demanded the same autonomy as the Hungarians. The Poles dreamed of a resurrected Poland. The very military that Friedrich was destined to lead was a reflection of this chaos. It was an army where officers had to speak German, but the enlisted men spoke one of 11 other official languages. It was an army struggling to modernize, still clinging to cavalry charges in an age of machine guns. its officer corps filled through connections rather than talent. This was the core problem. The necessity for change was overwhelming, but the system was designed to prevent it. The empire's rigid absolutism and the deep-seated favoritism shown to royal family members stifled innovation. Friedrich himself was a product of this. He was a good man, but he was placed in command not because he was a brilliant strategist, but because he was the right Habsburg. His massive inheritance in 1895 could have been a catalyst for reform. He had the wealth and the influence to push for modernization, to build a military force capable of surviving the 20th century. But that would have meant challenging the very system that had given him his wealth and status. It would have meant confronting the emperor, sidelining other aristocrats, and promoting men based on merit. Friedrich was not a revolutionary. He was an administrator. He chose to manage the system, not to change it. He embodied the empire's fatal flaw, a preference for comfortable aristocratic stability over the disruptive, necessary work of survival. This fatal passivity, this deference to the old way, set the stage for the catastrophes of 1914. He was the perfect man to preside over a parade and the worst possible man to command a war. His rise to power was therefore less a rise and more of a steady, predictable, and entirely conventional ascent. It was the antithesis of a disruptive breakthrough. He began his military career as a lieutenant in 1871 at the age of 15. His promotions arrived like clockwork, dictated by his age and his station. Major General in 1882, Lieutenant Field Marshal in 1889, General of Cavalry in 1894. These were not honors won in the crucible of combat. They were the expected steps on the career ladder for a Habsburg Archduke. His most significant posting was his long command of the V Corps in Pressburg, a position he held from 1886. Here, he proved to be exactly what the empire valued. He was reliable, he was affable, he was an excellent host, and he ran his administrative duties with quiet competence. He was not a firebrand like Conrad von Hötzendorf, nor was he a stern traditionalist like his uncle Albert. He was simply a pragmatic and stabilizing presence. The troops were well drilled, the paperwork was in order, and the local nobility was kept happy. This defined his personality in contrast to the old guard. While his uncle Albert had been an autocrat, a man who believed in the iron fist, Friedrich was a mediator. He was known for his polite, almost gentle demeanor. He preferred stability over brilliance, harmony over conflict. This made him well-liked, but also deeply underestimated. He was seen as a man who could be managed. His true vision, if it could be called that, was not military but dynastic. He saw his role as upholding the honor and stability of the Habsburg family. His allies were not rogue geniuses or innovative thinkers. They were the established figures of the court and the army's general staff. His shadow court was, in fact, his own family. His marriage to Princess Isabella of Croy in 1878 was a strategic success, forging an alliance with high-ranking European nobility and producing a large family, 8 daughters and 1 son. This family, however, would become the source of one of the great pre-war scandals that revealed the internal rot of the Habsburg court. While Friedrich was a quiet and dutiful man, his wife, Princess Isabella, was famously ambitious and a ferocious stickler for protocol. She was deeply proud of her own lineage and expected the world to acknowledge it. This put her on a direct collision course with the heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie Chotek. Sophie, though a countess, was not of royal blood. Their marriage was morganatic, meaning Sophie was denied royal status, and her children were barred from the succession. She was, in the eyes of archduchesses like Isabella, an inferior. Isabella took every opportunity to humiliate Sophie publicly. At balls, she would ensure that her own daughters took precedence over the wife of the heir. This bitter personal feud between the two highest-ranking women in the empire was not just court gossip. It poisoned the relationship between Friedrich's family and the heir to the throne. It demonstrated a court obsessed with petty slights and ancient rules, while the foundations of their world were cracking. This context is essential to understanding Friedrich's relationship with the man who would become his foil, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf. Conrad was the polar opposite of Friedrich. He was brilliant, imaginative, and utterly ruthless in his strategic thinking. He was also a paranoid workaholic, convinced that the empire's only hope for survival lay in a series of preventive wars. He relentlessly lobbied for invasions of Serbia and Italy, believing it was better to strike first than to be strangled by enemies. Friedrich, as a senior commander, recognized Conrad's intellect. While Friedrich himself was cautious, he was part of a system that admired, even if it feared, Conrad's aggressive energy. Friedrich supported Conrad's appointment as chief of the general staff in 1906. This was the fatal pairing. Friedrich, the passive, wealthy administrator, became the patron of Conrad, the reckless, obsessive strategist. Friedrich lacked the military genius to challenge Conrad's plans, and he lacked the iron will to veto them. He saw his job as enabling the experts, and Conrad was the acknowledged expert. Friedrich, the future commander-in-chief, had effectively outsourced his strategic brain to the most dangerous man in the empire. This dynamic was cemented by the time the crisis of 1914 arrived. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not just a political crisis. For Friedrich, it was a personal one. The man who had been his wife's bitter rival was gone. But his death also triggered the mechanism of war that Conrad had spent years building. The war party in Vienna, led by Conrad, seized the moment. They had their excuse to crush Serbia. The aging emperor Franz Joseph was manipulated into signing the declaration of war, and the army, the vast, multi-ethnic, creaking machinery of imperial defense, needed its symbolic head. On July 11, 1914, Friedrich was officially appointed supreme commander. This was on paper his peak. This was his game-changing victory. The crisis that the old guard had dreaded for decades was finally here, and the system had responded exactly as it was designed to. It placed a senior Habsburg, a man of immense wealth and prestige, a symbol of dynastic stability, at the head of the armies. Friedrich established his headquarters in the town of Teschen, from which he took his ducal title. It was a symbolic and brilliant choice. He arrived on the imperial train surrounded by his staff, ready to perform his sacred duty. His decisive action was one of profound and disastrous significance. He immediately confirmed that while he held the title of Supreme Commander, Conrad von Hötzendorf would have full and independent authority for all strategic and operational decisions. Friedrich's job, as he saw it, was to be the liaison between the army and the emperor. He would handle the politics, the promotions, the logistics, and the ceremonies. He would be the royal face of the war, visiting the front lines, bestowing medals, and projecting an aura of calm aristocratic authority. Conrad would actually fight the war. In the first few weeks, this seemed to work. The mobilization, though chaotic, was completed. The German allies were placated. Friedrich, in his role as mediator, smoothed over the fierce rivalries between Conrad and the Hungarian political leadership. The empire, it seemed, was resilient. Friedrich, at its symbolic military head, was proving his system right. The world seemed to be in their grasp, ready for a short, sharp war that would end by Christmas. This was the great illusion. Friedrich had just reached the pinnacle of his life, and in doing so, had guaranteed his own irrelevance and the destruction of his world. His greatest triumph was the precise moment of his most profound failure. The central paradox of Archduke Friedrich's life began to unspool the very second the war began. It was the terrible, grinding contradiction of a man who could, on paper, command armies and inherit empires of land, yet could not command true authority or prevent the catastrophic self-destruction of his own world. His fatal flaw was not arrogance or cruelty. It was the very quality that had defined his entire life, a profound, ingrained, and ultimately catastrophic passivity. He was a product of a Habsburg system that prized dynastic tradition and bureaucratic deference above all else, a system of nepotism that had placed him in a role he was temperamentally unsuited to fill. He was a man who, as his own archives and the accounts of his contemporaries show, possessed a gloomy, accurate foresight. He could see the disasters looming on the horizon, the danger of a two-front war, the unreliability of Conrad's obsessive plans, the existential threat of the Russian steamroller. But he lacked the will, the ruthlessness, and perhaps the self-belief to override the experts and the very system that had made him. His dark secret was, in fact, the most widely known truth in the Austro-Hungarian High Command. He was a nominal leader, a ceremonial figurehead, a royal puppet, in the words of later historians, who deferred entirely and explicitly to his chief of staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf. This arrangement, which Friedrich had established himself on the first day, was a ticking bomb. It stemmed from the core Habsburg tradition, the belief that a royal archduke's job was to preside, not to command. His presence was meant to lend royal authority to the professionals. But the professional he had chosen, Conrad, was a strategic gambler of astonishing recklessness. The result was that Friedrich, the supreme commander, became the passive enabler of the empire's ruin. The bill for this abdication of responsibility arrived almost immediately, and it would be paid in the blood of millions. The war began with two unmitigated disasters, born directly from Conrad's hubris and Friedrich's passivity. Conrad's entire war plan was built on a foundation of fantasy. He was obsessed with a punitive strike against Serbia, but he also faced the terrifying certainty of a massive Russian mobilization in the north, in Galicia. Instead of choosing one front, Conrad, in a fit of strategic arrogance, tried to fight on both simultaneously. He split his armies, sending a huge force south against Serbia while deploying the remainder in Galicia with antiquated plans. It was a catastrophe. The Russian Empire, which Conrad had fatally underestimated, mobilized far faster than expected and hurled a colossal army into Galicia. The Austro-Hungarian forces, still marching in their conspicuous peacetime blue and red uniforms, were not prepared for the realities of 20th century warfare. They were systematically annihilated by Russian machine guns and artillery. From his headquarters in Teschen, Friedrich, the administrator, could only watch the telegrams of doom flood in. His armies were not just defeated, they were routed. The great fortress of Lemberg fell. The Austro-Hungarian army, the professional peacetime force that had been the pride of the dynasty, was shattered, losing over 400,000 men in a matter of weeks. The survivors, a broken rabble, fled back to the Carpathian mountains, leaving the fortress of Dismissal besieged behind them. Simultaneously, the invasion of Serbia, the war's entire casus belli, turned into a national humiliation. The small, battle-hardened Serbian army led by the brilliant Field Marshal Radomir Putnik outmaneuvered and decisively defeated the larger Austro-Hungarian forces not once but 3 times at the battles of Cher and Kolubara. By December 1914, Friedrich's armies had been ignominiously kicked out of Serbia entirely. In less than 6 months, the Supreme Commander had presided over the effective destruction of his professional army and the failure of every single one of his initial war aims. The cost, as noted in military archives, was staggering. By the end of 1914 alone, the empire had suffered over 1.2 million casualties. Friedrich's passivity now created an inevitable and vicious cycle. He, the man who owned more land than almost anyone in Europe, had to go, cap in hand, to his German allies for help. The Germans, led by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, were contemptuous of their allies' incompetence but knew they could not let the empire collapse. This was the beginning of the alliance fracture, not a break, but a subjugation. The German High Command began to assert its authority, treating the AOK as a junior partner. Conrad, fuming from his defeats, reacted not with caution, but with even more reckless hubris. To relieve the besieged fortress of Dismissal, he ordered a series of suicidal, unsupported offensives into the Carpathian Mountains in the dead of winter 1915. This was the Carpathian Winter War, one of the most brutal and pointless episodes of the conflict. Friedrich, from his warm headquarters, dutifully signed off on the plans. His men, lacking proper winter clothing, food, or artillery support, were ordered to attack fortified Russian positions in chest-deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. Tens of thousands of soldiers simply froze to death. Men's rifles froze solid, their boots disintegrated. It was a meat grinder of indescribable horror, and it failed completely. In March 1915, Przemysl surrendered, and over 110,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers marched into Russian captivity. Conrad had sacrificed another army for nothing. The ticking bomb of Friedrich's deference had detonated, crippling the empire's military strength beyond repair. The only victories Friedrich would preside over were, in reality, Pyrrhic and German-led. In May 1915, the empire was saved from total collapse by the Gorlich-Tarnów offensive. It was a spectacular success, a massive breakthrough that shattered the Russian lines and pushed them hundreds of miles east. Friedrich was there for the ceremonies. He was awarded Germany's highest military honors, the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, and he was celebrated as a victorious commander. But it was a lie. The offensive had been planned and led by a German general, August von Mackensen, and spearheaded by German troops. It was a German victory, and it sealed the empire's fate as a vassal state. Friedrich was now a figurehead for Conrad, who was himself little more than a subordinate to the German general staff. This humiliation was immediately compounded. Just as the Gorlich-Tarnów offensive began, Italy, the empire's former ally, betrayed the Central Powers and declared war on Austria-Hungary, opening a brutal, new, mountainous front in the Alps. The empire was now fighting on 3 fronts, its armies hollowed out and utterly dependent on German support. This set the stage for the final fatal explosion of Conrad's hubris and Friedrich's passivity, the Brusilov offensive of June 1916. Conrad, obsessed with a personal vendetta, decided to launch his own punitive expedition against Italy, the Straff expedition in the Trentino. To gather troops for this venture, he stripped the Eastern Front of its best units, ignoring all intelligence that the Russians were preparing a massive attack. He left the front held by a thin line of demoralized mixed ethnic units, many of them Czech and Ukrainian, who had little loyalty to the crown. Archduke Friedrich, the supreme commander, knew this was a gamble. He foresaw the disaster. He had received the warnings. But once again, he lacked the will or the authority to override his chief of staff. He gave his assent. On June 4, 1916, Russian General Alexei Brusilov attacked. It was not a battle. It was an apocalypse. Using innovative tactics, the Russians simply dissolved the Austro-Hungarian lines. The ethnic troops that Conrad had left behind surrendered en masse. Entire divisions evaporated. The Austro-Hungarian 4th and 7th Armies ceased to exist. The city of Chernovitz fell. In a matter of weeks, the empire suffered another 1.5 million casualties, with nearly 400,000 men taken prisoner. The army was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed. It never recovered. The catastrophe was so total, so complete, that it triggered the collapse of morale on the home front and sealed the empire's doom. This time, the failure was too great to be hidden. Friedrich's passivity had enabled the final mortal wound to the empire. The Germans were forced to rush in, yet again, to plug the gaping hole, taking de facto command of the entire Eastern Front. The alliance was now one of master and servant. The betrayal Friedrich had experienced was not from his allies, but from his own subordinate, and ultimately from himself. But the final personal betrayal was yet to come. The world of the old guard that had protected Friedrich was also dying. On November 21, 1916, the aged Emperor Franz Joseph, who had reigned for 68 years, finally died. The man who had appointed Friedrich, the symbol of the entire dynastic system, was gone. He was succeeded by his young, energetic, and horrified grandnephew, Emperor Karl I. Karl had served at the front. He had seen the carnage and the incompetence firsthand. He despised Conrad and had no patience for the ceremonial, hands-off leadership of Friedrich. He was desperate to end the war and save his inheritance, and he knew he had to take control. On December 2, 1916, Emperor Karl I did what Friedrich, in his deference, would have considered unthinkable. He did not ask for a resignation. He summarily dismissed Archduke Friedrich as supreme commander. In a cold, brief decree, Karl announced that he himself was assuming supreme command of the armed forces. Friedrich, the senior archduke, the wealthiest Habsburg, the generalissimus, was unceremoniously fired. His 2.5-year tenure, which began with the illusion of supreme power, ended in this quiet, profound humiliation. He was betrayed by the very dynastic system he had served so loyally. His dynastic role, which was supposed to be his greatest asset, was rendered meaningless by a new desperate monarch who needed a commander, not a symbol. The early victories were exposed as German-led illusions, and the pyrrhic cost of his passivity was now fully realized. The empire was broken, and he was an outcast from the history he was meant to have written. The 2nd of December 1916 was not just a date, it was the precise moment the old world ended for Archduke Friedrich. The decree from the new young Emperor Karl I was a masterpiece of cold political necessity. It was not a request for resignation, nor was it a negotiated retirement. It was a summary dismissal. Karl, who had served at the front and seen the horrific incompetence of the high command firsthand, was cleaning house. He was desperate, frantic even to find a way out of a war that he knew was devouring his inheritance. He had no time for the ceremonial hands-off leadership of his great-uncle. The old guard, the generation of aristocratic figureheads that Friedrich embodied, was being swept away in a desperate gamble for survival. For Friedrich, a man whose entire identity was built on the foundations of duty, loyalty, and the sacred, unshakable hierarchy of the dynasty, this was more than a professional setback. It was a profound personal and public humiliation. He, the senior archduke, the wealthiest man in the family, the generalissimus appointed by the sainted deceased Emperor Franz Joseph, had been cast aside by a 29-year-old. His wife, the fiercely ambitious and protocol-obsessed Princess Isabella, was reportedly incandescent with rage. This was not just a dismissal. It was an insult to their branch of the family, a wound that would fester. Friedrich was promoted to a newly created and utterly meaningless role, deputy commander-in-chief. It was a title without an office, a rank without a command, a gilded cage designed to keep him quiet and out of the way. He was effectively retired, sent back to his palaces, to the magnificent Palais Erzherzog Friedrich in Vienna, or his beloved Weilburg Palace in Baden, to watch the world burn from a safe distance. He was still a field marshal. He was still an archduke. But he was now a political phantom, a man of immense theoretical importance and zero practical influence. He had become what he had always, perhaps, been, a spectator. And from his gilded cage he watched the final agonizing 2 years of the empire's collapse. This period for Friedrich must have been a unique form of torture. He was a man of gloomy foresight, a cautious administrator who had feared the very recklessness he had enabled. Now he was forced to watch in complete helplessness as all of his darkest predictions came true. In March 1917, he would have felt a grim, bitter satisfaction as Emperor Karl finally dismissed the other architect of the 1914 to 1916 disasters, Konrad von Hötzendorf. The man whose reckless genius Friedrich had unleashed, the man who had dragged him down into disgrace, was also cast out. But it was too late. The damage was done. The army was a hollow shell, and the empire was fatally wounded. Friedrich, the ultimate dynastic loyalist, then watched as the young emperor, in his desperation, began to break all the rules. He watched the unfolding of the Sixtus affair in 1917, Karl's amateurish, secret attempt to negotiate a separate peace with France, using his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, as a back channel. For a man of Friedrich's generation, this was unthinkable. It wasn't just the attempt at peace that was shocking, but the method. It was a breach of the sacred alliance with Germany, a violation of the Nibelung loyalty that the old guard held dear. When the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, publicly revealed the secret negotiations in April 1918, the scandal was catastrophic. It destroyed Karl's credibility. The Germans, now led by the ruthless duo of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, viewed Karl as a traitor. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was reduced to a state of total vassalage. At the Spa Conference in May 1918, Karl was publicly humiliated, forced to sign agreements that effectively merged his military and economic policy with Germany's. The German High Command was now the de facto supreme command of both empires. Friedrich's old job, the one he had abdicated to Konrad, was now being performed by a German general. It was the ultimate national humiliation. While the high politics played out, Friedrich watched the very fabric of his society, the society that had enriched him beyond measure, dissolve into chaos. The British blockade and the failing infrastructure, which could no longer transport food from the fertile Hungarian plains to the Austrian cities, created a nightmare of starvation. Vienna, the glittering imperial capital, was gripped by famine. The flour ration was bulked out with sawdust and powdered chestnuts. The coffee was roasted barley. Food riots became a daily occurrence. Strikes paralyzed the arms factories. Friedrich, insulated in his palaces, was shielded from the worst of the hunger, but he could not have escaped the sight of the unraveling. The empire was not being defeated from without. It was collapsing from within. The military, the institution to which he had dedicated his entire adult life, was the first to go. The army of 1918 was no longer the professional force of 1914. It was a starving, mutinous, multi-ethnic mob, held together only by habit and the fear of German firing squads. The Czechs, the Poles, the Croats, they no longer saw a reason to die for a German-dominated empire that was starving their families at home. Mass desertions became an epidemic. Entire units, particularly Slavic ones, refused to fight or simply surrendered at the first opportunity. Then, in the autumn of 1918, the entire political structure simply ceased to exist. It was the moment the Old Guard had feared for a century. As the war on the Western Front was clearly lost by their German masters, the nationalities of the empire, one by one, declared their independence. It was not a coordinated revolution. It was a universal abandonment. On October 28th, the Czechoslovaks declared their independence in Prague. On October 29th, the South Slavs in Zagreb declared the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. On October 31st, the Hungarian government in Budapest terminated the 1867 Compromise, effectively seceding from the empire. In a matter of days, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the 600-year-old creation of the Habsburgs, dissolved. It was not defeated in a great battle. It simply evaporated as its constituent peoples walked away. The final pathetic end came on the Italian front. On October 24, 1918, the Allies launched the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army, which was already in the process of dissolving, simply disintegrated. It was not a battle, it was a rout. The army ceased to exist as a coherent force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, broken and starving, abandoned their posts and began the long walk home, their only goal to get back to their new countries before the borders closed. The armistice signed at the Villa Giusti on November 3rd was a total unconditional surrender. 8 days later, on November 11th, 1918, the same day the guns fell silent on the Western Front, Emperor Karl I, from his palace at Schönbrunn, issued a proclamation. He did not formally abdicate. Instead, in a carefully worded legal document, he renounced participation in all state affairs and released his officials from their oath of loyalty. He was, for all intents and purposes, no longer a ruler. The following day, November 12th, the Republic of German Austria was declared from the steps of the Parliament building in Vienna. The Habsburg dynasty's reign, which had defined Central Europe for more than 6 centuries, was over. In his Viennese palace, surrounded by one of the world's greatest art collections, sat Archduke Friedrich, age 62. He was a field marshal with no army, an archduke with no empire, and a multi-millionaire whose vast, sprawling fortune now sat on the foreign soil of new, hostile, and revolutionary republics. He had survived the war without a scratch, but his entire world, the world that had created him, enriched him, and ultimately rejected him, was dead. His own personal war, the war for his fortune and his legacy, was just beginning. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. For Archduke Friedrich, the silence of November 1918 was more deafening than the cannons. He was no longer a commander, nor was he, in any meaningful sense, an archduke. The empire he had served, the 600-year-old political entity that had given him his name, his wealth, and his entire purpose, had evaporated in a matter of weeks. From his magnificent Viennese palace, the Palais Erzherzog Friedrich, he watched as his world was dismantled piece by piece, not by a foreign army, but by his own people. The immediate chaos was not one of battles, but of laws. The new Republic of German Austria, born from the empire's German-speaking heartland, was fiercely anti-Habsburg. The new government, a coalition of socialists and Christian Democrats, saw the dynasty as a toxic relic, the source of the war and the suffering. Friedrich, as the wealthiest and most senior member of the family, was a prime target. The decisive blow came on April 3, 1919, with the passage of the Habsburger Gesetz, the Habsburg Law. This single piece of legislation was the legal guillotine for the dynasty. It formally banished all members of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine from Austrian territory forever. There was, however, a loophole. Any Habsburg who was willing to formally renounce all claims to the throne, all titles, and all affiliations with the House of Habsburg, and declare themselves a loyal citizen of the Republic, would be allowed to stay. For Emperor Karl, this was an impossible demand. He saw himself as anointed by God and refused, choosing bitter exile. But for Friedrich, it was a simple pragmatic calculation. He was not and never had been in the line of succession for the main throne. He was a landowner, or at least he had been. His loyalty was to his property, his family, and his possessions. He, along with his family, formally signed the renunciation. In a moment, His Imperial and Royal Highness Archduke Friedrich Maria Albrecht, Duke of Teschen, ceased to exist. He became simply Citizen Friedrich Habsburg. This stripping of his identity, the very name that had defined his existence, was the first and most profound loss. But it was only the beginning. The new republics were not just revolutionary, they were broke, and they were hungry for land. Friedrich's vast supranational fortune was now scattered across 4 new hostile countries, each one eager to settle scores with the old regime. The dismemberment was swift and systematic. In Austria, the new socialist government looked at his opulent palace in Vienna, which housed the priceless Albertina art collection. This was, legally, Friedrich's private property, inherited from his uncle Albert. But in the eyes of the new republic, a private citizen owning such a national treasure was an obscenity, especially while the people of Vienna were starving. The collection and the palace were socialized, seized by the state for the public good. He was stripped of his Viennese home and one of the world's greatest collections of art without a shilling in compensation. Then came the hammer blows from the new successor states. The newly created nation of Czechoslovakia, led by the nationalist philosopher Tomáš Masaryk, was building a new identity. That identity depended on breaking the power of the old German and Hungarian aristocracy who had ruled them for centuries. In 1919, Czechoslovakia passed a series of sweeping land reform acts. These laws were specifically designed to break up the massive feudal estates, the latifundia, and redistribute them to Czech farmers. Friedrich was by far the largest landowner in the new republic. His estates at Silowitz and elsewhere were summarily confiscated by the state. The castles, the forests, the vast fertile farmlands, the breweries all seized. This was a devastating loss, carving away a massive portion of his wealth. At the same time, the resurrected nation of Poland followed suit. Friedrich's title, Duke of Teschen, came from this region. His industrial heartland, the source of the Teschen line's immense wealth, was centered on the estates at Saybush in Polish Silesia. This was not just farmland. This was a modern industrial complex with coal mines, timber operations, and one of the most profitable breweries in Europe. The new Polish government, eager to consolidate its national assets, viewed these properties as Polish land that had been exploited by an Austrian archduke. They were nationalized. The economic engine of Friedrich's fortune was gone. He was a ruined man. The wealthiest Habsburg had become a political pariah, stripped of his titles, his art, his palaces, his industries, and his lands. He was left with only one thing, his estate at Magyarovar in Hungary. Hungary, unlike the other states, had undergone a brief, terrifying communist revolution under Béla Kun, which was then crushed by a reactionary conservative counter-revolution led by a former Austro-Hungarian admiral, Miklós Horthy. Horthy declared Hungary a kingdom without a king, and this new, deeply conservative, aristocratic-led state was the one place in the old empire that still respected the old ways. They did not seize Friedrich's property, and so the former supreme commander of the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire retreated to his last remaining estate, a large country house in Hungary, to live out his days. This is the central irony of his death. Friedrich, the field marshal, who had nominally commanded armies of millions, the man who had signed off on plans that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands in the Carpathians and Galicia, did not die in battle. He did not go down with his empire. He died peacefully in his own bed on December 30th, 1936, at the age of 80. He died in a world that had made him obsolete. Adolf Hitler was already Chancellor of Germany. The Rome-Berlin axis had been declared. The continent was openly preparing for a new, even more horrific war, a war that would be fought over the very ethnic and nationalistic furies that his old empire had, for all its flaws, managed to contain. When he died, he was a footnote, a relic of a lost world, a field marshal of a ghost army. The issues he had so passively managed, ethnic fragmentation, military overreach, and German dominance, had all resurfaced, but in a more monstrous form. But the story of his chaotic legacy does not end with his peaceful death. It descends into a final grotesque tragedy embodied by his only son and heir, Archduke Albrecht Franz. Albrecht inherited a title without a state, a claim to a fortune that was now the property of 3 different nations. But unlike his passive, dutiful father, Albrecht was consumed by a bitter, burning rage. He was obsessed with one thing, reclaiming the family's lost wealth, particularly the vast industrial estates at Żywiec in Poland. He was a man driven by pure revanchism. He saw that his father's old world dynastic loyalty was useless. He decided to embrace the new rising powers. First, Albrecht became a rabid Hungarian nationalist. He became active in Hungarian irredentist politics, hoping that a resurgent Hungary would help him reclaim his family's lands in Czechoslovakia and Romania. But this was small scale. Albrecht looked to the real power rising in Europe, Nazi Germany. He saw in Adolf Hitler a force that would redraw the maps, destroy Poland and Czechoslovakia, and, in the process, restore his property. Albrecht Franz, the son of the last Habsburg generalissimus, made a Faustian bargain. He became an enthusiastic, vocal supporter of the Third Reich. He embraced the very racial nationalist ideology that was the antithesis of the old multi-ethnic Habsburg ideal his father had served. He saw the Nazis not as a moral horror, but as a practical tool for restoring his inheritance. This is the ultimate sickening irony of Friedrich's legacy. Friedrich, for all his fatal passivity, was a man of the Ancien Regime. He represented a dynastic, supranational order. His son, in a desperate, greedy bid to reclaim the money of that old order, fully allied himself with the most brutal, racist, and nationalist ideology in modern history, the very force that had been born from the ashes of his father's failure. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Albrecht Franz was there. As a reward for his collaboration, the Nazis gave him back his estates at Żywiec. He became a Volksdeutscher, a German citizen, and took possession of the brewery in the forests. His victory was complete. He had regained his fortune by collaborating with the murderers of the Polish state. This triumph was, of course, short-lived. The legacy was built on foundations of ash. When the Red Army swept through Poland in 1944 to 1945, Albrecht fled. The communists seized the estates, and this time the loss was final and absolute. The Teschen fortune and the family's legacy was not just dissolved, it was permanently morally corrupted and destroyed forever. To truly understand the tragedy of Archduke Friedrich, we must move beyond the lists of his lost estates and the dates of his dismissal. We must, in this final chapter, examine the inner world of the man himself and the crushing, complex, historical arguments about his culpability. His story is not just a sequence of events. It is a profound psychological and moral study of a man who is placed at the absolute center of a collapsing universe, only to be found hollow. His life poses a terrible question. Is it better to be a bad man who acts or a good man who does nothing? Let us first try to find the man. Contemporaries, from fellow officers to court diarists, were nearly unanimous in their personal descriptions of Friedrich. He was, by all accounts, an amiable, polite, and deeply conventional gentleman. He was thoroughly decent, a good host, a loving father to his 9 children, and a punctilious administrator. In a different era, he would have been remembered as the perfect aristocratic grandee, a man who managed his vast fortunes responsibly, patronized the arts, and fulfilled his ceremonial duties with a quiet Habsburg dignity. He was not a firebrand. He was not a brilliant intellectual. He was not a warrior. He was, at his core, a manager. His entire life was a study in responsible, cautious, and unimaginative stewardship. He was the ultimate company man, and the company was the Habsburg dynasty. This very decency, this amiability, is what makes his story so chilling. He was not a monster who delighted in war. He did not, like his German counterparts Hindenburg and Ludendorff, see soldiers as mere material to be expended. He was a man who, archives suggest, was genuinely distressed by the casualty lists. He was, as we've noted, a pessimist who saw the dangers of a multi-front war. Yet this good man sat at the head of a military machine that consumed millions of lives, and he did so in a state of almost total passivity. He would receive the daily reports from the front, the tens of thousands gassed on the Isonzo, the men frozen solid in the Carpathians, the legions surrendering to Brusilov, and his response was not to rage, to intervene, or to fire the man responsible. His response was to schedule another meeting, to mediate a dispute between a general and a politician, to ensure the paperwork was correctly filed for the emperor. He was the bureaucrat of the apocalypse. His personal life, too, was a perfect microcosm of the empire's ills. His marriage to the formidable Princess Isabella of Croy was, in itself, a study in the dynasty's fatal flaws. Isabella was fiercely ambitious, not for military power, but for social prestige. She was obsessed with the minutiae of court protocol. The infamous feud she waged against Sophie Chotek, the morganatic wife of the heir Franz Ferdinand, is one of the most revealing anecdotes of the pre-war era. While the nations of Europe were building dreadnoughts and forming alliances that would slaughter a generation, the highest echelons of the Austro-Hungarian court were engaged in a vicious public spat over who had to curtsy to whom. Friedrich, the passive husband, was caught in the middle, unable or unwilling to check his wife's ambitions. This wasn't just court gossip. It was a symptom of a ruling class that had lost all sense of proportion, a class that had become so inwardly focused on its own ancient rules and petty slights that it was blind to the existential inferno gathering on its borders. Friedrich, as the head of this family, embodied its focus on the trivial at the expense of the essential. Imagine, then, the psychological state of this man after December 1916. He is dismissed, humiliated, and sent into internal exile. He must now live in his Viennese palace, a man with a field marshal's baton but no army, reading the newspapers as the empire he was supposed to defend disintegrates. He must have been consumed by a bitter, silent "I told you so." He had warned in his own cautious way about Conrad's recklessness. He had seen the dangers. And yet his humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that he himself had done nothing to stop it. He had held the power of supreme command, the power to overrule, to fire, to change strategy, and he had simply handed it to someone else. It is the complex shame of the man who sees the catastrophe coming but is too polite, too bound by protocol, or too timid to pull the alarm. He was not just a victim of Emperor Karl's ambition. He was a victim of his own profound, lifelong inadequacy, an inadequacy that was, in fact, the very quality his class had been trained to value. This leads us to the central historical controversy. Was Archduke Friedrich a victim, or was he a culprit? Let us for a moment present the case for his defense. This argument states that Friedrich was merely a product and a victim of the Habsburg system. He was, in effect, a constitutional commander. His role was never intended to be operational. He was trained his entire life to believe that the Habsburgs reigned while the experts ruled. His job was to be the symbol of dynastic unity, the living flag, the ultimate mediator who stood above the professional squabbles. He was to be the link between the army and the aged emperor. By this logic, he performed his duty perfectly. He delegated to the acknowledged, if flawed, genius of the day, Conrad. He smoothed over the political infighting between the Austrian and Hungarian governments. He provided the necessary royal imprimatur for the war effort. To have done more, to have waded into strategy, to have fired the popular Conrad, to have contradicted the entire military establishment would have been an act of radical overreach, a violation of the very traditions he was appointed to protect. In this view, Friedrich was a tragic figure, a man of 18th century virtues crushed by a 20th century crisis that his system was never designed to handle. Now we must hear the prosecution. This argument is far more brutal. It states that Friedrich's passivity was not a virtue, but a criminal, moral failure. He was not a constitutional monarch. He was the generalissimus, the supreme commander in a military autocracy at war. He held absolute authority. The moment Conrad's initial catastrophic plans failed. In 1914, the moment the flower of the army was annihilated in Galicia and humiliated in Serbia, was the moment for a true commander to act. A true leader would have seen the suicidal recklessness of his subordinate and removed him. Friedrich did not. When Conrad sacrificed another army in the Carpathian winter of 1915, Friedrich did not act. When Conrad stripped the Eastern Front bare to pursue his personal vendetta against Italy in 1916, Friedrich, despite his own grave misgivings, signed the orders. The prosecution argues that every man who died in the Brusilov offensive, a catastrophe Friedrich explicitly foresaw, is partly his responsibility. His failure to wield the power he possessed makes him morally complicit in the empire's destruction. He was the ultimate empty suit, a man whose decency and politeness were just camouflage for a terrifying void of courage and conviction. He was the man who owned everything, and therefore had the most to lose, yet he refused to act to save it. The truth, as is so often the case, lies in the synthesis of these two arguments. Friedrich was the perfect product of his system, and the system itself was fatally, suicidally flawed. He was the walking, talking embodiment of the empire's core contradiction, a multi-ethnic state that demanded rigid German-centric aristocratic leadership, an ancient dynasty that faced a modern industrial war, a military structure that prized ceremonial obedience over brutal innovation. Friedrich was not an aberration. He was the system. His failure is the system's failure. He was the figurehead on a ship whose engines were designed by Conrad and whose hull was already rotten. His fatal flaw was that he chose to be the figurehead, not the captain. And so Archduke Friedrich's life had ended. But the grotesque consequences of his failure were just being born. The most immediate, as we have seen, was the catastrophic loss of his fortune and the moral corruption of his heir. The story of his son Albrecht becoming a Nazi collaborator to reclaim the family's Polish estates is the grotesque postscript to the Habsburg story. It is the final pathetic degradation of their entire raison d'être. The Habsburg ideal, for all its flaws, was supranational. It was about a dynasty ruling over peoples, not a race ruling over land. Albrecht's greed, his willingness to embrace a racial nationalist ideology, was the final betrayal of his father's entire world. It demonstrated that by the 20th century, the old aristocracy, when stripped of its power, had nothing left but its greed. But Friedrich's greater legacy is the void he left behind. The empire he so passively failed to defend, for all its bureaucratic inertia and its prison of nations, had served one crucial historical function. It kept the lid on the boiling pot of ethnic nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe. Friedrich's failure and the empire's subsequent collapse did not liberate these peoples into a new era of peace. It unleashed a Pandora's box of border disputes, ethnic grievances, and miniature imperialisms. The new, small, unstable states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia were weak, insecure, and spent the 1920s and 30s squabbling with each other. This chaotic, fragmented, and vulnerable landscape was the perfect hunting ground for the new predators that rose from the war's ashes, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. The failure of Friedrich and the Old Guard in 1914 did not just end their war, it directly created the conditions for the next one, a war that would be fought with even greater brutality over the very lands Friedrich had once owned. In the end, we return to our original question. Why have you never heard of Archduke Friedrich? We remember Napoleon, Wellington, Grant, and Zhukov. We remember the great villains, the brilliant innovators, and the tragic heroes. We do not remember the men who were simply there. Friedrich's ultimate legacy is his own obscurity. He is forgotten by history precisely because, at the moment of ultimate crisis, he did nothing to shape it. He held unimaginable privilege, wealth, and power, yet when handed the fate of an empire, he chose to stand aside. He is a testament to the fact that in times of crisis, passivity is not a neutral stance. It is a destructive act. He was not a monster. He was not a tyrant. He was perhaps something more tragically modern, a high-level administrator who enabled a catastrophe he was too polite and too timid to prevent. The priceless Albertina collection, which he lost, is now one of Austria's greatest treasures, a protected monument to a more elegant age. This is perhaps the most fitting metaphor for the Archduke himself. He was a relic from another time, a man of immense hereditary value, better suited to being preserved in a museum than to commanding a 20th century battlefield. He was the last grandee of the old world, a good man who presided over its death, and whose life serves as a quiet, devastating, and eternal warning about the catastrophic consequences of abdicating responsibility.